Hey everybody, so today I've decided to do a tutorial on my workflow for getting a Zbrush sculpt retopoed, UV'd and into Substance Painter for texturing. So I'm in Zbrush at the moment, and this is a recent piece that I've sculpted. So right now the piece, I might just show you the so this is the original sculpt and it's broken up in a few pieces. So got the leg, got an arm, another arm, another arm, the body and the head. So I don't actually have the previous subtools saved, or maybe I do. Let's crack it open. Yeah, okay. So this is pretty much early in this, maybe the first session. So I blocked out the pose, the major forms, with Sculptress Pro, and I always start my pieces with Sculptress Pro. So this is where I started, and you can see, you know, the gesture, the pose, it's pretty much all there. So the next step is looking at this. Okay, so this is pretty much almost there. So I decided to use a pillow and used Zbrush's dynamics for this. Pretty simple to do. You just inflate and then run the simulation and then use the body as a collision. And the body itself, it's pretty much to a finished state without any texturing. So the next step is I did a quick texturing pass. And let me just switch to the basic material. And we'll isolate this. So the texturing I've done with basic polypaint, and it's basically just using standard brush with RGB turned on and then an alpha. One thing that helps with texturing is in the brush settings, you've got these stroke jitter and brush imperfection. So playing around with these sliders will give you a bit more organic feel to either sculpting or texturing with polypaint. And if we look at the texture itself, it's pretty basic. But for what I want to do for this piece, should be more than enough. And I've only done basically the front side. Okay, switch back to preview. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to do is to make sure that all these different subtools are merged into a single subtool. Because right now, if you have a look, and if I go to auto groups, you can see that these are still in separate subgroups, meaning they're not one single mesh. So before I do that though, and I'll be using live Boolean to merge everything together. So I don't use Dynamesh, I use live Boolean. As I explained earlier, I do most of my sculpts with Sculptress Pro, and then I do use live Boolean to merge everything together. I don't like Dynamesh because it blurs the fine details, and especially if you have overlapping geometry like this, it just fuses everything together and then you don't get any gaps. So yeah, that's my workflow anyway, not using Dynamesh. Okay, so what I did just there as well is just to push the head from the arms out a little bit, just so when I use live boolean, I don't merge the head and the arm together. Um, Once everything's done, I can push that back in later. So just checking for any sort of overlapping or weird merging going on. So with that leg, let's see. Do I want to split it out a little bit? Yeah, let's just split it out a little bit. So, because I don't want to fuse this leg with the other leg. I want to keep them separate for now. And because the view will be from the front, doesn't really matter if the geometry is a little bit messy where it collides. Maybe a bit too much. So just making sure it's separated, that's all I'm doing. And you can always isolate it. I'm just using the Move Topology brush as well. Yep, so that looks good. And let's see, the tail as well. Just get this out of the way. So a little bit of cleanup. So most of the creative stuff is all done at this stage. So basically all I'm doing now is doing the technical stuff, making sure that the mesh is going to be okay for texturing in Substance Painter. Because for Substance, it does require a low-res geometry with UVs and with baked out normal maps. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's alright. Hopefully you'll learn something from these steps anyway. Might be worth watching. Okay, so that's all separated. I'll do a quick save before I do the live boolean. And right now at the moment, I'll do an auto groups. Okay. And then I'm going to hide the pillow because I don't want to merge that pillow with the body. And then what I'm going to do is go to split groups, and group split, and that's going to split each one of these parts into its own geometry. And then I'm going to use live boolean. So group split, okay. And you see what it's done is split out all the different parts of geometry into separate. And then what I'm going to do is use live boolean. And down the bottom here, I'm going to press the make boolean mesh. What that's going to do is fuse all these pieces together into one single mesh. So make boolean mesh. That's good, no errors. And what that does is it creates a separate subtool here, or creates a separate tool, I should say. And this mesh should be now all combined into a single mesh. So if I turn on the polygroups, you'll see that it's kept the different polygroups, but if I go to auto groups, you'll see that now it's one complete single mesh. Nice and clean, no hassles, and I've just realized I probably should have split this guy here. So let's delete that. So when you're retopologizing, it's usually better to not weld big overlapping pieces like this. Just keep them separate. Just makes the retopoing a bit easier. So it doesn't spaz out. Okay. And let's run live boolean again. auto group just to make sure everything is one single mesh still. And excellent. Okay. So the next step is just quickly going through here and just cleaning up where the joints have happened. And you see when you use live Boolean, it does keep the polypaint as well. So I'm just going to smooth out these intersection areas with Sculptures Pro. And before I do that, I'm going to press Shift and then turn off RGB smoothing. And make sure that my Sculptures Pro subdivide size is set to a size that I want. I don't want these areas to be too dense. That's all fine. So just going through, smoothing out any strange intersections, floaty bits. And it's just smoothing the geometry at the moment. If I take a look at the geometry, you see some weird stuff going on here. That's all fine because we're going to be doing retopologizing and then reprojection later on. So that can all stay. Just some of these little areas you might just want to smooth out. So the creasing or the pinching isn't too bad. Okay, that all looks good. And the next step will be doing the retopo. Before I do, what I want to do is just subdivide this one time to smooth everything. So you see I've got, right now it's fairly low poly, right? For this entire sculpture, it's around 500,000. So to do the retopo, before I do the retopo, I'll just subdivide it one time. And you see that it does smooth out the polygon looking artifacts. That just helps with the retopo and reprojection a little bit later on as well. Okay, so now I'm going to do the Zremesher or the retopo, and I'm going to duplicate this one and just hide the previous one. And using Zremesher, and if you're not familiar with Zremesher, it's an automatic script that retopos this high resolution mesh into a low resolution mesh that you can take into Substance Painter, Rig, whatever you like. So there are quite a few settings in here, and I'm not going to go through all this, and to be honest with you, the settings here take a little bit of experimentation. So you may, in one session, to get a nice retopo, you may need to do it 5 or 6 times. So let's just go ahead and run it on the default with adapt turned on at 5000, and we'll see what that gives me. So you never know, we may get a really good result off the bat. And because I'm not planning to rig this and animate it, doesn't really matter with regards to a topology that's animatable. All I'm looking for is a nice even topology that doesn't have any weird pinching or holes, so I can then reproject the detail and textures on there and then take into Substance Painter. And you know what? Done a pretty good job off the bat. Very, very good job, to be honest. And the fingers. So I'm just checking for holes, any sort of weird pinching. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So you see it took it down from 2 million polygons down to 10,000, or points I should say. So it's pretty awesome. It only took like 10 seconds to do that. Main thing I'm looking for in the Retopo as well is a silhouette. So sometimes when you go too low poly, the silhouette doesn't look right, and you get jaggedy edges like that. So let's just duplicate this guy. We'll keep that as a backup. And then I'm going to just run it again. And this time I am going to set the polygon count to 10 for the adaptive. And so that should give us double the polygon we had before, or points. And because what I'm saying is the original Zremesh is losing quite a lot of detail in here, in the fingers. And even with normal mapping in Substance, we're not going to get a nice look here for the fingers. So let's see, let's run it again with double the amounts. We'll see if we get a bit more detail. So it's taking a little bit longer now because it has more polygons to compute. Now what I might do, if this doesn't give us a good result, we can always use the previous one, but with the subdivided model instead of the original low res. Nope, that's pretty damn good. Okay, so 16, a little bit more. Got a little bit of weirdness going on here. No, that's okay. Yeah, got a little bit of pinching. Okay, so you see where it joined, where the fingers, I didn't move this guy out. Now, in the grand scope of things, it doesn't really matter. Don't get to see it, so I'm not going to worry about that, I don't think. And if we compare this one to the previous one, okay, so you know what? I am going to give myself a little bit more control, and I'm going to tell Zremesher that I want more polygons in the fingers. And you can do that quite easily by using the use polypaint function. And then you can use polypaint to tell Zremesher where you want more density. So before you do, you need to fill the current polypaint with color density set to 1, and just go to color and fill, and that's just a normal white. And now if you adjust that to 2, then make sure you're in the standard brush, and just with polypaint turn on, turn off any Z sub or Z add, and just paint the areas you want more geometry. Okay, so let's see how this looks. Maybe because this is quite, yeah, because we see the silhouette of the spine here quite prominently. What I might do is just give it a bit more topo here. Okay, so quick save again, and this time I'm gonna rerun Zremesher, and hopefully what this will do is Zremesher will give me more geometry just in the areas where you see red. I'll wait for this to compute. Now normally you would have to do this by hand and retopo everything polygon at a time by hand. So don't complain about, I never complain about how long Zremesher takes, because it's always going to be faster than doing it by hand. Alrighty, so that's pretty good. That's done an excellent job. So you see how much more polygon we're getting in the hand area, and it's captured pretty much most of the forms in the hand. And the back isn't too bad. Cool. So one last thing, and one thing I did forget to do is if I go auto groups. Okay, so that's all fine. Just make sure there's no sort of weird floating geometry inside, because when you do live booleans, sometimes you can keep geometry on the inside. So what I should have done is straight away after when I did the live boolean, is I should have done an auto group and just check to make sure there's no floating pieces, but that's all fine. In this case, there isn't. And what I want to do is just do a close hose, just to make sure there's no holes in the mesh. Cool. So now we're ready to move on to reprojecting the high resolution sculpture and texture onto this low resolution mesh. Okay, so we're going to project what we had, the high resolution detail in here, onto this low resolution substance painter ready geometry. And you see the Zremesher did a pretty good job. And you know, you might complain, oh, doesn't look very nice, you know, the topology flow isn't good for animation, blah blah blah. But just remember, this isn't going to be animated. So we basically just need a nice clean mesh we can take into Substance Painter. Okay, so I'm just going to delete this old one, and then with that original high-res one switched on, and just remember I've subdivided this one time to smooth things out. So back in here, I'm going to reproject using projector with geometry and color turn on. And then I'm going to do a Control D to subdivide the mesh one time. And then press projector again. And what I often do is during each step I will just spin the model around, make sure there's no weird stuff going on with the reprojection. Generally by default, the default settings here, they work fine. Subdivide one more time and then press projector. Okay, so you see the active points are now up to 350,000. And I'll subdivide one more time so we get to 1 million, and then press projector again. So this is basically transferring the detail from the messy high-res sculpt onto this retopologized clean mesh that we did using Zremesher. Okay. It's not too bad. So you can toggle between the original and the new one. And what I like to do before I export this out into Substance, just to squeeze a little bit more detail out, I can use the contrast filter. Just to squeeze a little bit more detail out of the mesh. So you can see here we're getting some artifacts, and that's simply because there's not enough polygons to hold the details in here. So what you can do is subdivide one more time, and we're getting a really high res mesh now on 5 million, but you'll see those artifacts are now smoothed out. So just looking at this, making sure we're all good. Cool. Okay, so the next step will be to put some UVs onto the low resolution mesh here. Because Substance Painter works off UVs, you need to do this step to get your mesh into Substance Painter. So before I do, I'm just going to do a quick save, and then maybe just save it as number 4 version up. And to work on UVs, you need to make sure that you're in the lowest subdivision level. So we're on sub D1. I'm just using Control D, D, and Shift D to go up and down. Just make sure you're on the lowest subdivision level. And then we are going to start polygrouping the mesh into separate UV islands. And this part here can take a little bit of experience to know where you should be splitting up the body parts. But generally speaking, you want to split things up so you don't have like a massive seam running down here, right in the center of the frame or the asset. You want to put seams in naturally where they occur, so we'll hide them in spots that aren't going to be seen. So the easiest one we want to do is the head. And when I'm doing this, I like to make sure double-sided is turned on. So what I'm going to do is just Control-Shift and hide a poly edge loop, and then use auto groups just to see if they have been split into clean groups, in which case it has not. So try this one. So I want to just split that head out into its own group, basically. Okay, let's do the head a little bit later because we've got all these other meshes in the way here. So let's just do the arm so I can quickly show you what I'm trying to achieve. And then you'll see that this arm is now a separate polygroup, which is all good. And then I'm going to just grow the selection a bit more. And then group visible. So now that's in its own group here, maybe too much. Okay, and now we'll do the rest of the body. So I'm just clicking in the center of the mesh, of the, what do you call it, edge loop, just to see if Zremesher has created a nice edge loop. And most of the time it will. And then I'm just growing the selection and then splitting that out into its own separate group. And I'm going to keep doing this for the rest of the body. Let's see, do we have a clean loop here? This one maybe? Oops. Cool. So overall, yeah, Zremesher has done a pretty good job in keeping nice edge flow, which makes this part a little bit quicker. Now, you can always use the automatic unwrapping in UVmaster, and it's going to try and do a pretty good job. But I like to do this step just so I can get a little bit more control. And this just helps with any sort of weird UV seams that UVmaster might generate. So we help the program along to do a better job, basically. Alright, so got the head here. This is what's giving us troubles before. And you'll see it's because there isn't a clean edge loop that's going all around the head. Which is fine, you know, because we won't be seeing the piece from the back. What I'm going to do is just manually start hiding polygons. Now again, this is just for me to get quickly this mesh into Substance Painter to do a single still image. For production work, you want to take a lot more time with this. And you know, most of the time you may need to do manual Retopo. But for art pieces, that's just going to produce a final still image. This will be fine. because you don't really want to get bogged down with technical stuff. We just want to quickly, as quick as we can, get the mesh into Substance Painter to do texturing and also rendering. Okay, so after all that, I'm going to group visible, make sure this is its own separate group, and it's looking not too bad. Do a quick save, and again, because we won't be seeing the body from the other side, all I'm going to do is just simply split this in half. And I know it's nasty, but should work fine. And we're going to get a nice unwrap, nice flat unwrap on the visible top side. Now for these arms, we may need to go in here and just isolate them and maybe do another split for these arms. So yeah, this is the boring part of the entire workflow. But this, you can't skip this step if you're planning to do texturing in Substance Painter, unfortunately. And trust me, just a couple of years ago, before Zremesher and UVmaster was available, you used to have to do this by hand, and it will literally take you days just to get a high-res mesh into Substance, and then or any other render package to texture and render. So all I'm doing is just splitting up more polygroups just to help the UVmaster with its Unwrap. And even with the tail, can help it even a bit more. Because again, just keeping in mind, I'm only seeing this from the top. So, looking at this, that's all good to go. And before I do UVmaster, I'm going to save my project or use quick save. So generally, before I do any sort of computation heavy stuff like Zremesher or UVmaster, I'll make sure I do a save, because while Zbrush doesn't crash all the time, it does crash. So always make sure you save your work. Okay, so now we've split up the model into different polygroups, and I'm just going to actually just split this head into half as well. We're going to run Zremesher, and we are going to remesh this. We're going to use UVmaster and then put some nice UVs on here so we can take it into Substance. So just make sure in Z plugins, UVmaster, just make sure polygroups is ticked or enabled, And what that's going to do is use all these polygroups we've spent the last 20 minutes splitting into its own UV islands, and you can leave symmetry on. That usually does a pretty good job, and we'll just hit unwrap. Okay, so that only took 15 seconds to unwrap this pretty complicated model. And to check the UVs, if you have subdivisions on, you need to go down to UV map and then just press the morph UV button. And what that's going to show you is the UV pelting that UVmaster has created. And what you want to check here is just make sure there's no weird overlapping pinching going on in the UVs. And it looks like UVmaster's done a pretty good job. So I'm just going to change the bump down to 0 so we don't see any artifacts. And that's now completely flat. Okay, so it's not too bad. What I might do is I might just split those years out into its own group, just so we get a better unwrap. And we want to just grab this okay, let's run UVmaster again. And you'll see that this year section should be its own little island now. There we go. And what you can always do is, if you want to check the UV density or the unwrap, is just throw UV texture on there. And you see there's not a lot of stretching or warping, and that means that once you go into Substance Painter, you're not going to get any weird texture stretching or anything like that. Okay, cool bananas. So, on to the next step. Okay, so this model is now ready for Substance Painter. Before I do that, I just want to quickly do the step, repeat the steps again for the pillow. I forgot to do the pillow, so let's quickly retopo this, throw some UVs on there, and we can bring both of these into Substance Painter for texturing. So this should be pretty quick and easy, but I thought I'll show you the steps anyway. What I want to be careful is these edges are going to look correct as the low res, so maybe a bit more density. Okay, and then this time we will use project history to project the details back onto this mesh. Just quickly check there's no errors. No. Okay, so to use project history, you can see right now it's grayed out. You need to use your history slider and then find the spot where you have the high resolution, holding down Control and then clicking on the spot. You'll see that it's now highlighted in white, and what that's going to do is when you press project history, it's going to take this particular history state and project it onto your low res. So now I'm just going to slide back to the low res and then use project history. Yes, and then I'll subdivide again, use project history. So this just saves you duplicating the mesh. And sometimes I find it does actually give you a nicer reprojection as well, especially for simple stuff like this. Okay, so that's not too bad. Do one more subdivide for the high res, smooth things out. Cool. And then we'll quickly throw some UVs on here. Should be nice and easy. I'm just going to split this in half. Auto groups. And we're just going to get a nice flat top here. And then go Z plugin, unwrap, polygroups turn on, unwrap. Just check the unwrap. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm just going to bring this pillow mesh into my retopod body. And I'm just going to delete this high res. Rename, do a little bit of cleanup, rename my low res body, and then we will save as a new scene file. Cool, so you see now I have all the mesh retopoed into low topology that's ready for texturing. Now next step will be to export the polypaint that I've already done on the body here, and also the high res and low resolution meshes into Substance Painter, and then we'll use Substance Painter to bake all the high res details onto the low res. Alright guys, so finally we are ready to start exporting into Substance Painter. So the first thing I want to do is actually bake out the polypaint texture that I've manually painted on the body here. And nice and easy way to do that is using Z plugin and then the multi-map exporter. Just going to select texture from polypaint and change that to 4K. It's all good. And now you're probably asking, well, John, why don't you bake out the normal maps in the multi-map exporter and then just import that into Substance? To be honest with you, Substance Painter has come a long way with regards to baking. So I do pretty much most of my baking in Substance Painter nowadays, and it's really fast and it does a really good job at baking. And you'll find that when you start exporting those normal maps out from Substance to different programs, Substance Painter handles the exporting of maps a lot better. It just supports a lot more different programs, third-party programs. So, but all I'm going to do is bake up the texture, because Substance can't actually grab the polypaint texture from your Zbrush sculpt. But yeah, using multi-map exporter, you can do that easily. Before you do that, just in case you want to, let's have a look. Go down to file names, export options, file names. Just make sure you export out the texture as TIFF. That's all fine, whoops. And we'll go create all maps. Save it as a body.tiff. And that didn't take long. And because I didn't paint anything for the pillow, I don't need to export the pillow texture, polypaint texture out. Okay. Now the next step will be to export both the high resolution mesh with all the sculpted detail, and also the low resolution mesh with UVs into Substance Painter. So to do this, I am going to use the FBX export and import under the Z plugin. And I am going to make sure that visible is selected. So what that's going to do is export both the body and the pillow out together into one single FBX, and then that means I can paint both the pillow and the body together at the same time in Substance Painter. And make sure bin selected, that's fine. You don't want to use embed maps, so make sure that's unticked, and make sure smooth normals is ticked. And then we'll hit export. So this is the low resolution, so make sure both the subtools are in the lowest resolution, and then we'll call this one sleeper low. Let's save. And the next thing we're going to do is just subdivide or switch to the high resolution on both of these. And you can simply go down here and then use all high, and that will just switch everything to the highest detail level. And then we'll do export FBX again, but this time using the sleeper high. It might take a little while because it's trying to export 7 million polygons. Alright, so we're back. So that actually took about 5 minutes, or maybe 3 minutes. Yeah, so depending on how quick and how dense your mesh is for the high res, may take some time to export the high res out. Now, another trick you can do is decimate these meshes, so they are still retain all the detail, but isn't so high polygon basically. But that's fine, because we're only baking in Substance, it should be fairly quick. So, okay, now we are good for Substance, so let's fire that up. Okay, so we are in Substance Painter now. Okay, so we are in Substance Painter now, and the first thing we're going to do is go to New, File, New, Start a New Project. Template, always use metallic roughness, alpha test, starter asset. Document resolution, set that to 4K. Normal map format, DirectX is fine. Now the file, next thing we want to do is click on select next to file, and we want to select the low resolution mesh we've exported out. Sleep on low, open, and click OK. Excellent. So you can see that the low resolution mesh has been imported into Substance, A-OK. And what I'm going to do, I just realized that I have my menus split up into my other screen, so I'm just going to stop the recording and then readjust my menu layout so you can see what's going on. Alright, welcome back. So I've imported in the low resolution mesh into Substance Painter, and I've just rejigged the interface slightly so it's all on the single screen. Typically when I work in Substance I have two screens. I have all these menus on my other screen, just so it's not so cluttered and cramped. Highly recommend two screen when using Substance Painter because there's just so much stuff going on. Okay, anyway, let's first thing we're going to do is bake all that lovely sculpted detail we had from Zbrush onto this low resolution mesh using normal maps. And in the texture set settings, actually, if we first go into a texture set list, you'll see that because we're using FBX, we can bring in different objects with separate texture sets. So meaning that I can texture both the body and the pillow separately or in the same Substance Painter scene basically. Just going to quickly okay, so make sure that the body is selected and then go to texture set settings, scroll down to the bottom, and you'll see under mesh maps, you've got bake mesh maps. Change the output size to 4K. Dilation width, change it to 16 depending on how big your UV layout was, but yeah, 16 or 32 is fine. Make sure apply diffusion is ticked. That just avoids any sort of UV seams you may have. And then under high definition meshes, we want to select, click on that little document button here, and then select sleeper high, open, and then down the bottom, scroll down. Just want to use the same settings as mine, but average normal, so I usually have that ticked. Anti-aliasing, I'll set that to 2, just gives a little bit crisper results. You can set that to high if your computer can handle it, but generally 2 is pretty good. And then on the left hand side, you can see all the different type of maps that Substance Painter can bake up. What you don't see here is displacement. So if you're planning to use displacement maps in a render engine, another render engine, you still need to do that in Zbrush's multi-map exporter, and that works just fine. But if you're working on low-res assets for game or any game engines, then yeah, substance painter is pretty good. And for these, I'll just scrub through so you can see the settings if you want to copy them, but they're pretty default. The most important thing is just set that to 4K and then put in your high resolution FBX here, and then click bake selected textures, and that's going to bake both the body and the pillow at the same time. Now this might take a little while, so let's see. So right now it's baking the normal maps first. And shortly you should see all the details pop back. Again, this might take some time if you're using, depending on your computer specs, obviously. One thing I've just noticed is got some issues with the pillows low res. High res, just in this area here. It's not too bad. We'll see if we can get away with it. But the body looks fine. Cool. So that didn't take long at all. And if you look at what we had before compared to what we have now, so we've got all the nice juicy details with sculpted in Zbrush onto this low resolution mesh that we can actually bring into a game engine like Unreal. And if we just do so the next thing we want to do is bring in the polypaint we did in Zbrush and put it onto the body. That's fairly simple. Okay, so we're just going to import in the polypaint texture of the body into Substance. And we want to use that as a starting base. So I'm just opening up my Windows Explorer, and then in the textures, if you remember, we exported it out as a TIFF, and then I'm going to just drag and drop this into the assets window here, and that's going to bring in the import resources window, and we've got the texture here. Click on undefined and just change that to texture. That's important. And then import your resources into project. Because this will be used throughout the entire project, just make sure you import it into the project. Hit import. And you see the color texture, the polypaint texture is here. And now we just want to quickly apply that onto the body. See how that looks. So just make sure you're in the body texture list. We've got a base color layer. Add a fill. And then in your base color, we just want to drag and drop this body texture onto base color. There you go. Just dull up the roughness a little bit so it's not so shiny. And texture set, switch to the pillow. I'll just quickly apply maybe a material, fabric material. we go. And you can see this is the UV view, so we can just quickly change that texture to be slightly bigger, just denser. And there you go. So this is a quick workflow breakdown on how you can take your high resolution ZBrush sculpture into Substance Painter for texturing using Zremesher to Retopo, quickly Retopo, high res to low res, and also UVmaster to do the UVs using polygroups, and then importing and exporting and importing both the low res and the high res into Substance Painter to do your substance texturing, and also exporting out any polypaint data you may have in Zbrush into Substance Painter. So if you like this tutorial, thanks for watching, and make sure you subscribe and stick around for more. I might do more Substance Painter tutorials in the future. So yeah, stick around for that. Thanks guys.